The gate log sat on a small wooden stand just inside the entrance to Hartwell Estate, sheltered from the weather by a short iron canopy that leaked at one corner when it rained. The woman standing at the stand that morning wore a canvas work jacket with a split at the left cuff, and she held the pen for a moment before she wrote. The log had columns: date, purpose of visit, full name, signature. She filled 3 of them. In the column marked full name, she wrote James. Just James. The gatekeeper, a man named Perry who wore a flat cap regardless of the weather, looked at the entry and looked at her. "That all?" "For now," she said. Perry shrugged and waved her through because there were 6 other seasonal workers arriving behind her, and he had a kettle on, and one woman's half-filled column was not his problem on a Monday in March. James walked through the gate and did not look back at what she had left incomplete. That was 31 days ago. She had come to Hartwell because the work was available, and the alternative was a 3rd month of administrative temping in a building with no windows and a coffee machine that dispensed lukewarm water, flavoured with the memory of coffee. The estate paid $12 an hour for garden staff, plus a small shared accommodation allowance if you lived on site, which James did not. She drove 40 minutes each way in a car that had begun making a soft grinding sound when she turned left, and she arrived each morning before 7 and stayed until the light failed her, because the work itself was the only part of the day she could control. Hartwell's walled garden was 4 acres of enclosed growing space behind the main house. It had been productive land for over 150 years, and some of what grew there had been growing there continuously for most of that time. There were espalier apple trees trained against the south-facing wall, their branches flattened and spread like open hands. There were beds of heritage roses that bloomed once, briefly in June, and were tended the other 11 months of the year with a precision that bordered on the ceremonial. There were soft fruit cages and cutting beds, and a section in the northeast corner that the oldest estate records called the Physic Garden, where medicinal and aromatic plants had been grown in a formal pattern that had been restored and then damaged, and then partially restored again over several generations. James had been assigned primarily to the cutting beds and the fruit cages, which were not glamorous but required consistent attention. Miriam Holt, the estate manager, had given her the assignment on her first morning in a tone that suggested the allocation was final and that questions about it would be unwelcome. Miriam was a compact woman in her late 40s who wore good shoes on rough ground and seemed to regard the mud as a personal inconvenience. She had been managing Hartwell for 7 years and knew every inch of its operational structure. She also knew, with the particular certainty of someone who had organized people into categories for a long time, exactly where each person on her staff fit. James, who had arrived with a reference from a municipal parks department and a canvas bag that held her lunch, fit in the category that Miriam thought of as capable but unremarkable, useful in volume, not to be invested in. You'll rotate through the fruit cages on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, Miriam had said that first morning, standing in the archway that separated the kitchen garden from the cutting beds. Tuesday and Thursday, you're in the cutting beds. The schedule is on the board in the potting shed. If you're unclear about a task, ask Delia. She had paused. Not me. Delia was a stout woman in her 60s who had been coming to Hartwell for 3 seasons and who wore the same navy waterproof jacket every day, regardless of the weather. She had a habit of talking while she worked, not to anyone in particular, but to the plants, which she addressed as though they had opinions about their own care. She had found James on her first morning before Miriam had finished her orientation speech and had pressed a flask of tea into her hands, without ceremony. You'll want that, Delia said. March is cold work even when it's sunny. James had taken the flask and drunk the tea, standing beside a raised bed of overwintered kale, and she had felt, for the first time since arriving, that she was in a place that would tolerate her being there. She had not told Delia her last name either. She had not told anyone at Hartwell her last name. There was no rule against it, and no particular reason she could name. She was not hiding from anything she could point to. She had simply walked through that gate and offered only what had been asked for, and it had felt correct in a way she did not examine. The man she first saw in the walled garden on her second day was working the espalier apples on the south wall. He was tall and moved carefully with the economy of someone who had done a thing so many times that the motion had become its own argument. He wore old work trousers and a waxed jacket that had seen considerable use, and his hands on the pruning shears were clean and steady. James noticed the hands, because she noticed hands, because hands told you what a person's actual history was, regardless of what they said about themselves. She did not speak to him that morning. She had her own section to attend to, and the custom among seasonal garden workers was to exist in companionable quiet for a reasonable time before acknowledging each other. It was its own courtesy. He spoke first on the morning of her third day, when she was on her knees beside a fruit cage examining a section of netting that had torn away from its support at one corner. "Left side of the base is loose as well," he said from a few feet away. James sat back on her heels and looked at the base, and he was correct. And the whole left side had pulled free of the ground anchor. "I see it," she said. "There's spare netting in the second shed," he said. "Left wall, middle shelf." He said it as someone who knew where things were kept, which was the same way Delia said things, and James filed it alongside his steady hands as further information about him. "Thanks," she said. He nodded and went back to the section of hedge he had been addressing, and that was the whole of their first conversation. His name was Rowan. She learned it from Delia, who said it the way she said everything, as a straightforward fact. "That's Rowan. He does the structural work mainly, the hedging and the walls. Been here longer than I have." She paused, pulling on a glove. "Quiet man. Good worker. Doesn't make a fuss." James thought that was a reasonable description. What Delia did not say, because Delia didn't know, was anything else about him. He ate his lunch when the others ate theirs. He arrived before everyone and was still in the garden when most people had left. He never asked for anything, did not position himself for the tasks that would keep him visible to Miriam's surveying eye, and spoke when spoken to with the precision of someone who had learned that unnecessary words created unnecessary obligations. If there was something odd about him, James could not name it. The oddness was more of a texture than a detail, the specific quality of someone whose stillness was not the stillness of someone without interior weather, but the stillness of someone who had decided to be still. The first 3 weeks of James's work at Hartwell were shaped by the cold, by the repetitive rhythm of tasks that had to be done the same way every day, and by Miriam's particular method of management. Miriam would appear in the garden at least twice each morning, walking the paths with her clipboard, pausing beside each worker long enough to find something to redirect. With the male workers, she was efficient and specific. With James, she was specific, and then something else. A tone that sat just beneath the line of being correctable, as though she wanted James to understand that her position in the garden was provisional and conditional on Miriam's ongoing assessment. On James's 14th day, Miriam stopped beside her while she was tying in a climbing rose. "That's not the correct gauge of wire," Miriam said. James looked at the wire, which was the gauge specified in the task notes on the board in the potting shed. "The board says 18 gauge, James said. "The board was updated last week," Miriam said. 16 gauge for climbers. If you had checked before you started, you would know that." James said nothing. She untied the section she had done and began again with the heavier wire, which Miriam watched for a moment, before continuing down the path. Delia, working 2 beds over, did not look up from the peonies she was dividing, but she pushed a bundle of the correct wire across the gravel path with her boot, silently, so James would have enough. On James's 18th day, a small group of Miriam's guests came through the garden on what the estate called a curated tour. They were women in good coats who walked slowly and asked questions in the practiced way of people who were interested in being seen to be interested. Miriam guided them with the ease of someone who knew the garden as a performance space. When they passed James, who was kneeling between two rows of sweet peas, one of the women asked Miriam what the sweet peas were. "Heritage varieties," Miriam said. "We maintain them as part of the estate's provenance." She did not indicate James. One of the other women looked down at James as she passed and said, warmly enough, "You must love this work." "I do," James said. Miriam moved the group along before anything else could be exchanged, and James listened to their voices recede down the path and went back to her tying. It was on the morning of her 23rd day that the wages matter occurred. Miriam came to the potting shed on a Thursday morning when 6 members of the garden staff were there collecting their weekly pay envelopes, which were prepared by the estate's housekeeper and collected by Miriam for distribution. It was an old-fashioned system that Hartwell had maintained for the seasonal workers specifically, and James had come to regard Thursday morning as a small, reliable hinge in the week. Miriam handed envelopes to 5 people, and then stood with her clipboard. "James," she said. James waited. "There was an error in your hours log for week 3, Miriam said. "You logged 8 hours on the Tuesday, but the gate record shows you left at 4:15. That's 7 3/4. James had left at 4:15 that Tuesday because the light had failed earlier than expected, and the task she'd been given was one that couldn't be done in poor light, without risking damage to what she was working on. She had noted it in the task log. She had not noted it, apparently, in the hours log. "The discrepancy," Miriam continued, "means your payment cannot be processed until the record is corrected and reviewed. You'll receive last week's pay with this week's." It was approximately $280. James looked at Miriam steadily and said, "When will the review be complete?" "When I have time to review it," Miriam said, and turned to discuss something with the housekeeper. Delia caught James's eye as they filed out of the shed. She gave her a look that was not quite pity and not quite apology, but contained both. And James shook her head a small amount, which meant she did not need either. She needed the money. She was not going to say so. On the morning of her 24th day, the temperature dropped below freezing before dawn and did not recover by the time the garden staff arrived. The sky was the colour of cold metal, and the breath of the workers made small temporary clouds above the vegetable beds. James had brought a lunch she hadn't had time to eat yet by 10 in the morning, and she was working her way along a section of box hedging near the south bench when she heard someone else arrive at the bench. She glanced over. It was Rowan, sitting on the far end of the stone bench with his hands around a cup of something, looking across the kitchen garden in the way he sometimes looked at things, as though he was reading them. James had her lunch bag over her shoulder. She sat down on the other end of the bench, which was far enough from him to be reasonable, and opened the bag. She had a sandwich and a small container of soup that she'd kept warm in a thermos and a piece of shortbread wrapped in paper. She had also, that morning, packed an extra sandwich on a reflex she hadn't examined, because the cold did that, made you pack more than you needed. She set the extra sandwich on the bench between them without comment. Rowan looked at it. "I packed too much," she said. He picked it up. He ate it in the same way he did most things, with a precise attention that was not self-conscious. He didn't say thank you in the first few seconds, but about 4 minutes later, when she was finishing her soup and he was looking back across the garden, he said, "That was good." "Cheddar and something from a jar," she said. "I don't know what the jar was. It came with the room." The room? The flat I'm renting, she said. Off the main road about 6 miles. Came furnished, including the condiments. He said nothing for a moment. Then, how long is the drive? About 40 minutes, she said. More when there's weather. He looked at the sky in a way that suggested he had specific opinions about what weather was coming and did not share them. They sat for another few minutes in a quiet that felt, to James, like the right kind of quiet. Not the quiet of two people with nothing to say, but the quiet of two people who didn't need to fill the space between them to be comfortable in it. That was all of it. She went back to the box hedging. He went back to wherever he'd been going before the bench. But for the rest of that day she was aware of where he was in the garden, in the way you become aware of a sound that you realize has been there all along, only notice now that you've named it. The proximity accumulated in small, specific increments over the days that followed. On the 26th day, they worked the same section of the south wall for an entire morning, she tying in and he repointing the mortar in a section of wall that had crumbled over winter. He passed her the trowel without being asked when she reached for it. On the 27th day, he brought 2 cups of tea from the potting shed and set one beside her without ceremony. On the 28th day, she asked him whether the heritage apple on the far left of the south wall was losing a main branch, and he came and looked at it with her, crouching beside the base of the tree and pressing his thumb into the bark near the graft union, and said, "Yes, but it'll come back if you cut it here," and indicated a point about 8 inches from the crotch. "Leave the stub, let it callus over, and by August it'll have a new leader." She had not asked how he knew. There was a quality to the way he spoke about the garden that suggested the knowledge was native, not acquired. He did not cite sources. He did not explain himself. He simply knew where things were, how they worked, and what they needed. With the ease of someone who had been given that knowledge so long ago, he had stopped being aware of having received it. "Have you worked here a long time?" she asked. He paused before answering, which she had come to understand was his normal pace and not hesitation. "A while," he said. "Do you stay on over winter?" "Sometimes," he said, and then, after another pause that had a different quality to it, "I travel some." She accepted that. She was not, she reminded herself, entitled to the whole story. On the evening of the 29th day, James was walking back from the potting shed to the section of garden where she had left her tools, cutting through the narrow passage that ran between the potting shed's back wall and the stone wall of the old forcing house. It was late enough that most of the other workers had gone. The forcing house was used now as a storage building, and its windows were high and small and let sound out efficiently. She was not looking for anything. She was collecting her secateurs from where she'd left them on the bed marker. Through the wall, Miriam's voice came clearly. She was talking to someone, a woman James didn't recognize by her higher, lighter tone, who seemed to be one of the estate's periodic visiting agents or consultants. James could not see them, and they could not see her. "You get a type," Miriam was saying, "with this work. Seasonal. Drift in from wherever. Do reasonable work. Drift out again." A murmur from the other woman. "This one," Miriam said, and there was something in her voice that placed the pronoun without needing a name. "Won't even give you a full name. Signed in as James at the gate. Just James. No surname, as though she has something to conceal." A pause. No background, no reference beyond a parks department, no reason to be here beyond wages. You give them the work that needs doing, and you don't expect anything more. The visiting woman made a soft, agreeable sound. "The type that passes through," Miriam said, and moved away from the wall. James stood in the passage and did not move for a moment. She had not expected to feel it the way she did. She had expected, If she ever heard something like this, to feel the cold, procedural clarity of a fact confirmed. Instead, she felt the passage narrow around her. She felt the precise dimension of what Miriam had decided she was, and the way it had been decided without any input from her, and the ease with which a woman who had never once asked why James had not given her full name could speak the absence of that name as evidence of something concealed. She was not concealing anything. She had given only what the log required. She had signed her name at the gate the way she had signed her name everywhere for the last 2 years, since the divorce. Since the period of her life she was still in the middle of deciding how to carry, when her full name on a form felt like wearing someone else's coat. She had not told anyone this. She had not explained it, because it had not seemed to require explanation. It required nothing. She pressed her back against the stone wall for a moment, and felt the cold come through her jacket and counted the ivy leaves in the mortar crevice to her left, which was a thing she did when she needed to be in her body instead of in her thoughts. There were 9. She collected her secateurs from the bed marker and walked to the gate. She said nothing to Delia. She said nothing to anyone. She drove home in the car that ground softly on left turns and sat in the small furnished kitchen with its inherited condiments and ate a piece of bread and looked out the window at nothing for a while. She did not leave. That mattered. She drove back the next morning at 6:45 in the cold with a packed lunch that had, without her consciously deciding it, an extra sandwich in it. It was on the afternoon of her 30th day that she went to the northeast corner. The physic garden had been partially restored and then damaged in a wet summer 3 years prior, according to the estate notes she had read in the potting shed on her first week. A section of heritage planting along the north edge had been lost to flooding, and attempted replanting had not taken well. The task notes said the section was pending assessment. Pending assessment at Hartwell meant that no one with authority had yet made a decision, which meant the section sat in a state of managed neglect that was clearly not doing the remaining plants any good. James had been looking at it for a week, not because it was her section, not because anyone had asked her to look at it. She looked at it because she passed it twice a day, and because the gap in the heritage pattern was specific and identifiable if you knew what had been there before, and she had read the estate's historical records carefully enough to know what had been there before. The specific plants were a variety of hyssop that had been grown at Hartwell continuously since the 1880s, a particular sweet Sicily that the records listed by a cultivar name she had needed to look up, and a low-growing Artemisia that matched a description in the oldest of the potting shed's logbooks. The hyssop and the Artemisia she had found after some searching at a specialist nursery 40 minutes in the opposite direction from her flat. The sweet Sicily had required 2 calls and a drive on her day off. She had spent $43 on 9 hyssop seedlings, $67 on 3 sweet Sicily starts, and $58 on 2 Artemisia plants, which brought her total to $168 out of her own pocket on 14 heritage seedlings that no one had asked for and that she would leave behind when the season ended. She planted them on the afternoon of the 30th day, working from 5 until nearly dark, on her own time, after her paid hours had ended. The ground was still cold enough to resist the trowel in the top 2 inches. She kneeled on the old flagstone path and worked the soil with her hands before the trowel, loosening it, pulling out the gravel that the flooding had deposited, amending it with the bag of grit and compost she had brought from the second shed. She set each seedling with the care you give to something that has already been in the ground 140 years and is being asked to continue. The light was nearly gone when she pressed the last Artemisia into place and watered it from the can she had carried from the tap near the forcing house. The section looked provisional, the way new plantings always looked, small and temporary against the scale of the old stone wall behind them. But the pattern was correct. She had checked it twice against the sketch in the records. She gathered her tools and walked out of the physic garden without telling anyone. She did not know that Rowan had been at the far end of the south wall when she arrived at the northeast corner. She did not know that he had stood there for a while in the failing light, watching. She did not know any of what he was thinking, because the expression he wore looking at her work from a distance was the same careful, contained expression he wore in every other circumstance. And she was not watching him. She was watching the hyssop. He had not moved until she left. He had not spoken, had not called out, had made nothing of the fact of his presence. He had simply seen it, and then he had walked back through the garden the long way, the way that did not require him to pass through the section where she would be putting away her tools, because there were things he needed to think about that he could not think about, and also be near her. On the morning of the 31st day, Gerald Whitmore arrived at Hartwell Estate. He came in a dark car that parked in the main courtyard, which the working staff could see from the kitchen garden, because the gate between the two spaces stood open in the mornings. He was a tall man in a good coat and shoes that were not suited to the gravel, carrying a leather case that was worn at the handles, in the way of things that had been used a long time. He came through the gate into the kitchen garden with the bearing of someone who knew the property well and was not treating the visit as a social call. Miriam intercepted him near the espalier apples. James could see the exchange from where she was working, though she could not hear it. She saw Miriam's posture shift when he spoke, the slight adjustment that happened when Miriam was recalibrating the level of formality she was operating at. Delia appeared at James's elbow with her customary lack of announcement. "That's the estate's solicitor," Delia said. "Comes a few times a year, business of some kind." James was about to say something ordinary in response when she heard it. The man, Gerald, had turned from Miriam toward the south wall, and his voice carried across the kitchen garden in the quiet of the morning. "Mr. Ellery," he said, and the way he said it was not the way you addressed a fellow worker or a seasonal labourer, but the way you addressed someone to whom you were professionally accountable. "I have the documents you asked to review on site, whenever you're ready." Rowan had been at the south wall. He had been tying in a new leader on the old apple, the same tree James had asked him about 3 days prior, the one she had decided would come back if cut at the right point. He turned from the tree and looked at Gerald with a steady, unsurprised expression, and he said, "Give me 10 minutes." And Gerald nodded and went to stand near the courtyard gate with the leather case. James was looking at Rowan. The light was cold and white that morning. The sky cleared after a night of low cloud, and it lay across the garden without flattery, showing things as they were. She looked at the way he stood after Gerald had gone, the way his posture did not change, did not perform, did not expand to fill the new public fact of what he was. He was still holding the pruning shears. He set them on the wall cap without hurry and stripped off his work gloves and folded them into his jacket pocket. And then he looked across the garden toward where James was standing beside the sweet pea stakes. He looked at her with the same expression he had used for the past 31 days. There was nothing in it that was an apology. There was something in it that was a question, or perhaps not a question, but a fact being offered carefully. Miriam had turned from Gerald's direction and was looking across the kitchen garden with an expression James had never seen on her face before. A particular stillness that was the stillness of someone revising a very large number of decisions simultaneously. "Delia," James heard from across the path, and Miriam's voice had a different quality to it, an audible care. "Is James available?" Delia turned to look at James with an expression that was warmly, quietly incredulous. James set down the twine she had been holding and walked towards the courtyard. Miriam was standing near the gate with Gerald, who had opened his leather case on the low wall and was laying out papers that required Rowan's attention. Rowan stood across from him, reviewing the top document with the reading posture of someone who knew what he was looking for. James stopped a few feet away, not because she had been asked to stop there, but because it felt like the right distance to absorb what was happening. Miriam looked at her. It was the first time, James thought, that Miriam had looked at her in exactly that way, which was the way of someone who was trying to read the room she had apparently been living in all along. "I wanted to say," Miriam began, and stopped. There was something that happened to people when the world they had constructed with such care turned out to be built on a misassessment. Not a destruction, not a collapse into pieces, but a visible recalculation, the face rearranging itself in real time around a new premise. Miriam's face did that. It was not a comfortable thing to watch, and James did not watch it unkindly. "The physic garden," Miriam said. "Someone has done work in the northeast section." "I did," James said. "Last night. After hours." Miriam was quiet for a moment. "That was heritage stock." "The varieties match the 1880s logbook," James said. "The pattern is correct. The hyssop and artemisia came from Barnfield Nursery. The sweet Sicily took a bit of finding." Miriam opened her mouth and then closed it, which James thought was the appropriate response. Gerald, who had been laying out papers, said without looking up, "Mr. Ellery has been wanting someone to address that section for 2 seasons." Miriam said nothing. Rowan set down the document he had been reading and looked at the physics garden, or toward it, because from the courtyard you could not quite see the northeast section. "Were the seedlings paid for from the estate account?" he asked. It was not a challenge. It was a question about a material fact. "No," James said, "from my own pocket." A short pause. "How much?" he asked. $168, she said. 14 plants. The hyssop was the best value. The sweet Sicily was not. He looked at her. The look lasted longer than the previous ones, and had something in it that the others had not, though she could not have named what the something was precisely. Gerald cleared his throat in the way of solicitors who have witnessed many things that were not strictly their business, and have learned to make the clearing of a throat do the work of several polite sentences. "The wages matter," Rowan said, and he said it to Miriam, and the 2-word phrase, said in that tone, in that company, contained everything it needed to contain. Miriam's chin moved slightly. "Should be corrected today." "Yes," Miriam said. "Not of course, not certainly, just yes," in the voice of someone who had understood the dimension of what was happening to her authority and was making the only response available to her. Delia had appeared in the gateway behind James and was leaning against the stone with her arms folded and an expression of careful, composed satisfaction that she was making no effort to conceal. James turned to look at her briefly. Delia said, very quietly, "There it is." James looked back at Rowan, who had turned to the last of Gerald's documents and was reading it with the same unhurried attention he gave to everything. He did not look up immediately, but she had the clear sense of being held in someone's peripheral vision with complete deliberateness, the way the garden itself was held in a particular quality of attention that turned out to have been his all along. By noon, the wages were delivered. The envelope arrived with the housekeeper, who also brought a second envelope that James opened in the potting shed after the housekeeper left, and which contained a check for $168 with a small printed note from the estate office that said, in plain type, "Heritage stock replacement, Northeast section, approved." James held the check for a moment and then folded it and put it in her jacket pocket. beside the lunch she had packed that morning. Delia was sitting on the overturned bucket she used as a seat in the potting shed, drinking her tea, and she said nothing at all, which was its own form of eloquence. In the afternoon, when the light shifted from the white cold of the morning to the low, warm gold of a March afternoon nearing 4 o'clock, James walked to the northeast corner of the physic garden to check on the new plantings. The hyssop looked as it had the night before, small and tentative. The sweet Cicely had not moved, which was what you wanted. The Artemisia had caught the light at a particular angle that made it look more established than it was. She heard footsteps on the flagstone path behind her and turned. Rowan came to stand beside her at the edge of the physic garden bed. He looked at the plantings for a moment and said, "You match the cultivar names from the logbook." "It took a bit of reading," she said. "It did," he agreed. There was something in his voice she had not heard before, or perhaps had heard, and had not allowed herself to note. A warmth, plain and specific, that had the quality of something that had been there a while. She looked at the new hyssop plants in their cold ground and thought about 31 mornings driving through the dark on the left grinding road, and the envelope of wages she had not received for a week, and the sound of Miriam's voice through the wall of the forcing house naming her as the type that passes through, and the 9 ivy leaves in the mortar crevice she had counted to stay in her body. She thought about the gate log with its empty column. "You knew," she said. It was not an accusation. "I learned on the 3rd day," he said. "Perry keeps a second log." She considered this for a moment. "Perry should mind his second log," she said. Rowan made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was the sound that lived in the same neighbourhood as one. It was the first time she had heard it, and it had the effect of making the afternoon feel several degrees warmer than the thermometer would have supported. "The name," he said. His voice was careful now, the way he was careful with things that mattered. "You don't have to say." "James Clark," she said. "Just that. The way you say something that fits when you've been carrying it at an angle for a while and finally set it down straight." She said it to the hyssop plants in the northeast corner of a physic garden that had been growing at Hartwell Estate for over 150 years. And she said it to the man standing beside her who owned the ground it grew in, and she said it without drama because the moment did not require any. Rowan was quiet for a moment. "Rowan Ellery," he said, as though she had not known it since the morning. "I know," she said. "I thought you might," he said. The afternoon light had reached the angle where it caught the top of the old stone wall and went gold above the espalier apples, their spread branches making their orderly pattern against the warm stone. The garden smelled of cold soil and something green coming through it, the particular smell of things pressing up from the root before the air had caught up with what was already happening underground. James Clark stood in the physic garden at Hartwell Estate on the last afternoon of her 31st day and did not feel like the type that passed through. She felt like someone who had been in this place for 150 years and was only now being seen in full. She bent and pressed 2 fingers into the soil beside the nearest Artemisia plant, checking the drainage, checking the contact of root to ground, doing the small necessary thing that the plant needed because it was the next thing to do. Rowan did not leave. He stood at the edge of the bed as the light thinned above the wall. The gate log, somewhere behind her at the entrance to Hartwell Estate, had her first name in it and an empty column where the second half belonged. 31 days ago she had stood at that stand and offered only what had been asked for, and it had felt correct in a way she had not examined. She understood it now. The column had been empty not because there was something to conceal. The column had been empty because she had not yet found the place where the rest of it was safe to put. She had found it now.